let me know if you are here and you're on Facebook. Oh, I see one person. I want to make sure Facebook is here for real before I start Instagram. We're doing Tween the Pages today. It's time. Oh, 3 people are here. I think that means everything's working, but I can't see if anybody is saying they can see me for sure yet. Okay, I think we're good. Oh, okay. Gabe can see me on Facebook. That's good. All right. Let me start up Instagram. Oh, yikes.
Hi, Instagram.
Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. Hi everybody, thanks for bearing with me. All right, hello to everybody on Instagram. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Once I start seeing friends are connecting. Can only Gabe and Henry see me on Facebook? Let me know if you're here, and I'm going to get started reading holes. Is that Evelie? Hi, Henry. Hi, Gabe. All right, I think we're okay. We're reading holes again today, guys. We're on chapter 26. I hope you are all nice and comfy. Before I get started reading, I just wanted to give a little warning. We're a bit worried today since it's so windy outside. We're worried that we might have problems with the internet because I live a little outside of Shelburne. I don't live right in town. So sometimes when it gets really windy, I have problems with my internet. So if something happens and you all of a sudden can't see me very well, and if you switch over to Facebook, you still can't see me very well, I am going to keep recording the rest of the reading that we're doing, and we'll put it up on YouTube or on our Facebook page, and you guys can catch up after, all right? I just want to say that right away because it sounds very windy outside right now, and I don't want to lose all of you all of a sudden with no explanation. Hi! Okay, so last week we stopped where Miss Catherine and Sam have fallen in love with each other, haven't they? But the town isn't very happy with that because they have different sorts of jobs. She's a teacher and he's an onion picker, and they don't want them to be together. They want Miss Catherine to marry someone like the school teacher, or like Trout Walker, who owns all the peach trees and everything in town. I'm sorry, I have a little tickling in my throat, so that's why I have 2 kinds of drinks. I'm going to be drinking a lot while we're reading today. So, we are still back in time with Miss Catherine today. And we're going to pick back up after Hattie Parker saw Sam and Miss Catherine kissing by the schoolhouse. We're going to see what happens next. There were no telephones, but word spread quickly through the small town. By the end of the day, everyone in Green Lake had heard that the school teacher had kissed the onion picker. Not one child showed up for school the next morning. Miss Catherine sat alone in the classroom and wondered if she'd lost track of the day of the week. Perhaps it was Saturday. It wouldn't have surprised her. Her brain and heart had been spinning ever since Sam kissed her. She heard a noise outside the door, and suddenly a mob of men and women came storming into the school building. They were led by Trout Walker. "There she is," shouted Trout. The mob was turning over discs and ripping down the bulletin boards. "She's been poisoning your children's brains with books," Trout declared. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Books are good for your brain. That's silly. Trout sounds like a silly guy. They began piling all the books in the center of the room. "Think about what you're doing," cried Miss Catherine. Someone made a grab for her, but she managed to get out of the building. She ran to the sheriff's office. The sheriff had his feet up on his desk. "Morning, Miss Catherine," he said. "They're destroying the schoolhouse," she said, gasping for breath. "They'll burn it to the ground if someone doesn't stop them." "Just calm your pretty self down a second," the sheriff said in a slow drawl, "and tell me what you're talking about." He got up from his desk and walked over to her. "Trout Walker has—" "Now, don't go saying nothing bad about Charles Walker," said the sheriff. "We don't have much time," urged Catherine. "You've got to stop them." "You're sure pretty," said the sheriff. Miss Catherine stared at him in horror. The sheriff did nothing. He just sat down and leaned back in his chair and took a sip from his mug and looked at her. "Why aren't you doing anything?" pleaded Catherine. "I always finish my coffee before I start the day's hunt for criminals." "Hunting for criminals? What?" "It's against the law for the onion picker to kiss the school teacher. You're not the same class." "Well, you'll have to arrest me too," said Catherine. "I kissed him back." "It ain't against the law for you to kiss him, just for him to kiss you." "We're all equal," she declared. The sheriff laughed. "Then if Sam and I are equal, why won't you kiss me?" He laughed again. "I'll make you a deal. One sweet kiss, and I won't arrest your boyfriend. I'll just run him out of town." Miss Catherine jerked her hand free. As she hurried to the door, she heard the sheriff say, "The law will punish Sam, and God will punish you." She stepped back into the street and saw smoke rising from the schoolhouse. She ran down to the lakefront where Sam was hitching Mary Lou to the onion cart. "Thank goodness I found you," she sighed, hugging him. "We've got to get out of here now." "What?" "Someone must have seen us kissing yesterday," she said. "They set fire to the schoolhouse. The sheriff said he's going to arrest you." Sam hesitated for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe it. He didn't want to believe it. "Come on, Mary Lou," Sam said. "We have to leave Mary Lou behind," said Catherine. Sam stared at her a moment. There were tears in his eyes. "Okay." Sam's boat was in the water, tied to a tree by a long rope. He untied it, and they waded through the water and climbed aboard. His powerful arms rowed them away from shore. But his powerful arms were no match for Trout Walker's motorized boat. They were little more than halfway across the lake when Miss Catherine heard the loud roar of the engine, and then she saw the ugly black smoke. These are the facts. The Walker boat smashed into Sam's boat. Sam was killed in the crash. Catherine Barlow was rescued against her wishes, and when they returned to the shore, she saw Mary Lou's body lying on the ground. The donkey had also been killed by Trout. That all happened 110 years ago, and since then, not one drop of rain has fallen on Green Lake. You make the decision. Whom did God punish? 3 days after Sam's death, Miss Catherine poisoned the sheriff with rattlesnake venom while he was sitting in his chair drinking a cup of coffee. Then she carefully applied a fresh coat of red lipstick and gave him the kiss he had asked for. For the next 20 years, kissing Kate Barlow was one of the most feared outlaws in the West. That was a pretty crazy chapter. That was pretty bananas. So Miss Catherine, the school teacher, turned into Kissin' Kate Barlow, the feared criminal of the West. It's very sad that all that happened with Trout crashing into Sam's boat and doing all of those mean things just because they had different jobs. It's very sad. This is why I miss when we were sitting in a group and we could talk about this all together, because if you have any questions about things that happen, make sure you're asking your parents or the people who are watching these videos with you, because I can't always hear the questions you're telling me if you don't have time to type them to me. So if you have any questions about what happens, make sure you double check or ask, or if anything seems scary that I'm reading, make sure you talk about it with somebody. Okay. Chapter 27. We're back with Stanley. Stanley dug his shovel into the ground. His hole was about 3.5 feet deep in the center. He grunted as he pried up some dirt and then flung it off to the side. The sun was almost directly overhead. He glanced at his canteen lying beside his hole. He knew it was half full, but he didn't take a drink yet. He had to drink sparingly because he didn't know who would be driving the water truck the next time it came. 3 days had passed since the warden had scratched Mr. Sir, and every time Mr. Sir delivered water, he poured Stanley straight onto the ground. Thanks, Evely, for saying okay. Fortunately, Mr. Pendanski delivered the water more often than Mr. Sir. Mr. Pendanski was obviously aware of what Mr. Sir was doing because he always gave Stanley a little extra. He'd fill Stanley's canteen and then let Stanley take a long drink and then top it back off for him. That's nice of Mr. Pendanski. It helped, too, that Zero was digging some of Stanley's hole for him. Although, as Stanley had expected, the other boys didn't like to see Stanley sitting around while they were working. They said things like, "Who died and made you king?" or "It must be nice to have your own personal worker." When he tried pointing out that he was the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds, the other boys said it was his fault because he was the one who spilled them. "I risked my life for those seeds," Magnet had said, "and all I got was one lousy handful." Stanley had also tried to explain that he needed to save his energy so he could teach Zero how to read, but the other boys just mocked him. Stanley dug out another shovelful of dirt. He knew X-Ray wouldn't have been talking like that if he were the one teaching Zero to read. Then X-Ray would be talking about how important it was that he got his rest, right? So he could be a better teacher, right? And that was true. He did need to save his strength so he could be a better teacher, although Zero was a quick learner. Sometimes, in fact, Stanley hoped that the warden was watching them with her secret cameras and microphones so she'd know that Zero wasn't as stupid as everyone thought. From across the lake, he could see the approaching dust cloud. He took a drink from his canteen and then waited to see who was driving the truck. The swelling on Mr. Sir's face had gone down, but it was still a little puffy. There'd been 3 scratch marks down the side of his cheek. 2 of the marks had faded, but the middle scratch must have been the deepest because it still remained. It was a jagged purple line running from below his eye to below his mouth, like a tattoo of a scar. Ooh, that's long. That's all the way from below his eye, all the way down below his mouth. Stanley waited in line and then handed Mr. Sir his canteen. He held it up to his ear and shook it, and Mr. Sir smiled at the swishing sound. Stanley hoped he wouldn't dump it out. To his surprise, Mr. Sir held the canteen under the stream of water and filled it. "Wait here," he said. Still holding Stanley's canteen, Mr. Sir walked past him and went around the side of the truck and into the cab where he couldn't be seen. "What's he doing in there?" asked Zero. "I wish I knew," said Stanley. A short while later, Mr. Sir came out of the truck and handed Stanley his canteen. It was still full. "Thank you, Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir smiled at him. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Drink up." He popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, chewed, and spit out the shells. Stanley was afraid to drink. He hated to think what Mr. Sir could have put in it. Rattlesnake venom? Dirt? He brought the canteen back to his hole. For a long time, he left it beside his hole and continued to dig, and then, when he was so thirsty that he could barely stand it anymore, he unscrewed the cap and turned the canteen over and poured it all out onto the dirt. He was afraid that if he'd waited another second, he might have taken a drink of it. Do you think Mr. Sir would have put rattlesnake venom in the water? After Stanley taught Zero the final 6 letters of the alphabet, he taught him how to write his name. Capital Z-E-R-O. Zero wrote the letters as Stanley said them. "Zero," he said, looking at his piece of paper. His smile was too big for his face. Stanley watched him write it over and over again. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. In a way, it made him sad. He couldn't help but think that 100 times 0 was still nothing. You know, that's not my real name, Zero said, as they headed to the rec room for dinner. Well, yeah, Stanley said. I guess I knew that. He'd never really been sure. Everyone always calls me Zero, even before I came here. Oh, okay. My real name is Hector. Hector, Stanley repeated. Hector Zeroni. Oh my goodness! Zero's last name is Zeroni. Does anyone remember who else's last name was Zeroni? Let me see. I'll give you a minute to try and think. Does anyone remember whose last name was Zeroni? Can you think? Do you remember Madame Zeroni from the beginning of the book? Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten great-great-grandfather was supposed to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain so that she could get a drink of the water. And now, we just found out Zero's last name is Zeroni. How crazy! He must be related to her somehow. Okay, we're back in time again. Chapter 28. After 20 years. No. Oh, Evelyn didn't remember who it was? So Hector Zeroni is Zero's real name, which means he's related to Madame Zeroni, the lady who put the curse on Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. How crazy. That is a crazy connection. After 20 years, Kate Barlow returned to Green Lake. It was a place where nobody would ever find her. A ghost town on a ghost lake. The peach trees had all died, but there were a couple of small oak trees still growing by an old abandoned cabin. The cabin used to be on the eastern shore of the lake. Now, the edge of the lake was over 5 miles away, and it was little more than a small pond full of dirty water. She lived in the cabin. Sometimes she could hear Sam's voice echoing across the emptiness. Onions! Sweet, fresh onions! She knew she was crazy. She knew she'd been crazy for the last 20 years. Oh, Sam, she would say, speaking to the vast emptiness. I know it's hot, but I feel so very cold. My hands are cold, my feet are cold, my face is cold, and my heart is cold. And sometimes she would hear him say, I can fix that, and she would feel his warm arm across her shoulders. She'd been living in the cabin about 3 months when she was awakened one morning by someone kicking open the cabin door. She opened her eyes to see the blurry end of a rifle 2 inches from her nose. She could smell Trout Walker's dirty feet. You got exactly 10 seconds to tell me where you've hidden your loot, said Trout. She yawned. A red-headed woman was there with Trout. Kate could see her rummaging through the cabin, dumping drawers and knocking things from the shelves of cabinets. The woman came to her. Where is it? She demanded. Linda Miller? Asked Kate. Is that you? Linda Miller had been in the 4th grade when Kate Barlow was still a teacher. She'd been a cute, freckle-faced girl with beautiful red hair. Now her face was blotchy and her hair was dirty and scraggly. It's Linda Walker now, said Trout. Oh, Linda, I'm so sorry, said Kate. Trout jabbed her with the rifle. Where's the loot? There is no loot, said Kate. Don't give me that, shouted Trout. You've robbed every bank from here to Houston. You better tell him, said Linda. We're desperate. You married him for his money, didn't you, said Kate. Linda nodded. But it's all gone. It dried up with the lake. The peach trees, the livestock. I kept thinking it has to rain soon. The drought can't last forever. But it just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Her eyes fixed on the shovel, which was leaning up against the fireplace. She's buried it, she declared. I don't know what you're talking about, said Kate. There was a loud blast and Trout fired his rifle through the window and it shattered. Where is it buried? He demanded. Go ahead, Trout, said Kate, but I sure hope you like to dig, 'cause you're going to be digging for a long time. It's a big, vast wasteland out there. You and your children and their children can dig for the next 100 years, and you'll never find it. Linda grabbed Kate, and she said, by the time we're finished with you, you're going to wish you were dead. I've been wishing that for the last 20 years, said Kate, and they dragged her out of bed and pushed her outside. Kate wore blue silk pajamas. Her turquoise-studded black boots remained beside her bed. Do you recognize some of these things that they're saying? Do you remember who else wears turquoise-studded cowboy boots? The warden has turquoise-studded cowboy boots. And the warden has red hair like Linda Walker does. And the warden lives in a cabin with 2 oak trees by the side of a dried up lake. This is a lot of stuff matching up to our story, isn't it? They loosely tied Kate's legs together so she could walk, but she couldn't run, and they made her walk barefoot in the hot ground. They wouldn't let her stop walking. You're not allowed to stop walking till you take us to the loot, said Trout. You're going to take us to it sooner or later, said Linda, so you might as well make it sooner. Kate walked one way, then the other, until her feet were black and blistered. Whenever she stopped, Linda pushed her on with the shovel. I'm losing my patience, warned Trout. She felt the shovel jab into her back, and she fell hard onto the dirt. Get up, ordered Linda. Kate struggled to her feet. We're being easy on you today, said Trout. It's just going to keep getting worse and worse for you until you take us to it. Look out, shouted Linda. A lizard leapt toward them. Kate could see its big, red eyes. Linda tried to hit it with the shovel, and Trout took a shot at it, but they both missed. The lizard landed on Kate's bare ankle. Its sharp black teeth bit into her leg, and its white tongue lapped up the droplets that leaked out onto the wound. Kate smiled. There was nothing they could do to her anymore. Start digging, she said. Where is it? Linda screeched. Where'd you bury it? Trout demanded. And Kate Barlow died laughing. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, Emily was just going to ask me about the cowboy boots and the cabin. So, now in our book it says we're on part 2, the last hole. I wonder what that means. But what we just learned at the end of part 1 is it looks like the warden lives in that same cabin with the 2 oak trees on the edge of the dried up lake. It looks like the warden has Kissing Kate Barlow's boots that she had when she lived on the lake. And it looks like Kissing Kate Barlow was just killed by a yellow spotted lizard. So we know that those are super deadly, right? And now there's so many of them on the lake. And now we also know that Camp Green Lake actually was a lake before. But these are all mysteries that we weren't sure about. But now we know the answer. And now I think we can say for sure that the warden is looking for treasure. Don't you think? I think we can definitely say that she's looking for treasure now. Alrighty. I think today we're reading until chapter 30. And we're on chapter 29. Part 2. There was a change in the weather for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat, and beads of moisture ran down the handle of his shovel. It was almost as if the temperature had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake. A storm was way off to the west beyond the mountains. Stanley couldn't count more than 30 seconds between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. That's how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually, Stanley couldn't see the mountains at this time of day. The only time they were visible was just at sunup before the air became hazy with heat. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountains would appear. "Come on, rain," shouted Armpit. "Blow us away." "Maybe it'll rain so hard it'll fill up the whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming for real." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we better start building us an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow-spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, had made Zigzag's head even more wild-looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck almost straight out. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on top of one of the mountain peaks. The peak looked to him exactly like a giant fist with a thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone, and Stanley wasn't sure whether he'd seen it or not. "I found refuge on God's thumb." That's what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded in the desert. No one ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he said it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? "I don't know. I wasn't there," replied his father. "I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was a nurse at the hospital where they treated him. He'd always talked about how she'd dab his forehead with a cool, wet cloth. He said that's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was a real angel." A real angel? His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he survived? No, he just blamed his no-good, pig-stealing father. The storm moved off farther west along with any hope of rain, but the image of the fist and the thumb remained in Stanley's head. Although instead of lightning flashes behind the thumb, in Stanley's mind, the lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it were the thumb of God. Chapter 30. And we'll see. We might get to 31, but I'm not sure. I think we might only get to 30. 30 looks like a long one. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone else headed outside. "I get to sleep in because it's my birthday." Then a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. "Hey, it's my birthday," Zigzag said, staying where he was. "It's not your birthday," said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. "Is too," said Zigzag. "July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. It could have been July 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake. If indeed it was July 8th. "I came here on May 24th, he said aloud. "So that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days. It felt more like 4,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day, and he hadn't dug one today. That meant he dug 44 holes, if it really was July 8th. "Can I have an extra carton of juice?" Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. "It's my birthday." To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. "Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest," he said to himself. But that wasn't really true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir no longer deprived him of water. After having to get by on less water than anyone else for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water he could ever want. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging. But it wasn't a lot better. When the sun came up a couple hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one mountain seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun, reflecting off of the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. And if that really was her lipstick tube he found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of the hole and Zero climbed into it. "Hey, caveman," said Zigzag. "You should get a whip. Then if your worker doesn't work fast enough, you can crack it." "This was Zero's idea, not mine," said Stanley. "Don't you know, Zig?" said X-Ray. "Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes." "He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him," said Squid. "Well, what about me?" asked Armpit. "I like to dig holes too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished?" The other boys laughed. "No, I want to," said Zigzag. "It's my birthday." Stanley tried his best to ignore them all. Zigzag kept at it. "Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig." Stanley smiled as if it were all a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with the water at lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line. "Since you're so much better than me," he said. Stanley remained where he was. "I didn't say I was better than anyone." "You're insulting him, Zigzag," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "Sure you are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "That's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Go to the front." Stanley hesitated and then moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he would be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore, but he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into a sandwich which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. If you can only get groceries once a month, you have to get things like stuff that comes in a can, right? A lot of us are kind of doing that right now, buying groceries once a month. We have to get a lot of boxed pasta and cereal and dry food. That's probably what it's like at Camp Green Lake all the time. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No, thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed Stanley. "Don't push me." "I didn't push you." Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. "I said, don't push me." Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, "Quit pushing." "Lay off," said Armpit, as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined them. "Why should he?" snapped X-Ray. "Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself." This isn't very good, is it? Stanley's not pushing at all. It's just Zigzag keeps pushing Stanley and is making trouble. It's not fair. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward them along with Zero. "Hi, Mom," said Armpit. "We're just fooling around." "I saw what was going on," Mr. Pendanski said. He turned to Stanley. "Go ahead, Stanley," he said. "Push him back. You're bigger." Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. "Come on, Stanley, teach him a lesson, said Mr. Pendanski. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with an open hand. Teach me a lesson, he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to push Zigzag away from him, and then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag was holding on to his collar and hitting him. The collar ripped, and Stanley fell backward onto the dirt. That's enough, Mr. Pendanski yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. Stop, shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fists kept hitting his arms and face, and all on the ground. All Stanley could do was wait for it to be over, and then suddenly Zigzag was off of him. Stanley managed to look up, and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a choking sound as he desperately tried to pull Zero's arm off of him. Let go of him, shouted Mr. Pendanski. But Zero kept holding. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold, and the three boys fell to the ground in different directions. This is getting crazy. This is why it's not good to try and solve your problems by fighting, right? Stanley didn't want to fight at all, but Zigzag just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And now things are getting out of hand and people are starting to get violent, right? It's not really a good way to solve the problem. The other counselors came running from the office in tents or out on the lake. The warden walked over from her cabin. What's going on? She said. There was a riot, Mr. Pendanski told her. Zero almost strangled Ricky. The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck, and then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. Well, what happened to you? She said. Nothing. It wasn't a riot. Ziggy was beating up the caveman, said Armpit, and then Zero started choking Zigzag, and then I had to pull Zero off of Zigzag, and it was all over. It was all over. Then it was all over. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is. In the sun all day. People get hot, right? But everything's cool now. It's fine. I see, the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray. Out in the sun all day. You know how it is. The blood starts to boil. Is that what happened, Zigzag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said. Working so hard in the hot sun, while Caveman just sits around doing nothing, my blood boiled. Excuse me? Said the warden. Caveman digs holes just like everyone else. Zigzag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn how to read? Stanley asked. Doesn't that build the character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. Well, Zero, what have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing? The warden asked him. He likes to dig holes, Mr. Pendanski said. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Surely you can remember that. Zero said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well try to teach a shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero. I learned the at sound, said Zero. The at sound, repeated the warden. Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew the answer why Zero didn't want to answer. He just didn't like answering people's questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius! F-A-T? Asked the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F at fat. How about H-A-T? Asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard and then said, H, chat. All the counselors laughed at Zero. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize that it was very logical for Zero to think that the letter H made the ch sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, said the warden, and no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kiss and Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole but still teach Zero how to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but let's face it. Zero can't learn how to read. That's what's making his blood boil, not the hot sun. Do you guys think that's true? Do you think Zero can't learn how to read? Because I think he's doing pretty well. And I think how they're talking about Zero in front of all the other campers and in front of Zero is not very nice. That is not the right way to talk about someone. We would never talk like that about people we know. Oh, man. That is what's making his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel, and then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed into Mr. Pendanski's face, and his knees crumpled beneath him, and he was unconscious before he hit the ground. Zero held the shovel out in front of him as if he were going to try and bat everyone away. I hate digging holes, he said, and then he slowly backed away. He can't go anywhere, said the warden. Leave him. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up, out past the cluster of holes that the boys had been digging, and then farther and farther out onto the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and put him into the truck. Stanley looked out towards Zero, but Zero had disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. Uh-oh! Things are getting exciting in this book. And that's the end of chapter 30. So we'll start on chapter 31 next week. And like we've said a couple of times, there's only 50 chapters in this book. And we've already read 30 of them. Can you believe it? We are more than halfway. This is how much we have left. We're more than halfway through this entire book. That's amazing. Did any of you have questions about what we read today? Oh, Emily thinks Zero can learn how to read. I think he's already learning too. He's doing a good job. He even figured out a way to sound out the letters that he didn't even know the sounds to. And just because Zero isn't great at reading yet, doesn't mean that he's not good at anything, because he is spectacular at math. Stanley says it all the time, how he's so good at math. It's amazing. Okay. Somebody's giving me lots of hearts on Instagram. So, the activity that I thought of for this week, and yeah, that's very good. The activity I thought of for this week is, in our readings, we spent a lot of time talking about the history of Green Lake and the past of Green Lake and why there's no rain and why Kissing Kate Barlow might have buried her treasure there. And what I would like you guys to do is I want you to write about or draw about, if you don't think you have all the words to write about it yet, is if you could go back in time to any time ever, where would you want to go and why? Would you, some examples could be, maybe you want to go back to when there was dinosaurs. That would be cool. A little scary, but cool. Maybe you want to go back in time 3 months when you were still allowed to go to McDonald's. Maybe you want to go back in time to when you went to Canada's Wonderland in the summer. For me, I am really interested in like medieval times. I really like kings and queens and princes and princesses. I think that would be cool for me if I went back in time and could see all of that for real life. That would be lots of fun. So that is our activity for this week. And like all the other weeks, if you do this activity and you have a cool picture or writing even that you want to share, you can email it to me at children@shelburnelibrary.ca, or you can just tag the library on Instagram or Facebook, and then we can share it with everybody who looks at our Facebook page and our Instagram page. It would be really cool. And I don't know if I said this, but I did make a worksheet you can print off to do these activities, but you don't have to use the worksheet to do that. You can always just draw it on your own piece of paper, or maybe some of you even have drawing apps on your iPad or something like that. That would be a cool way to do it too. But yeah, that's it for this week. Next time I'll be back. Reading Holes is next Tuesday, April 28th, and we'll read another 4 or 5 chapters of this story, and we'll be even closer to the ending. What do you guys think's gonna happen to Zero? He's all alone in the desert with no water. It's crazy. All right. Everybody have a good rest of the day. I miss you all, and I'm glad we got to hang out this afternoon. I'll see you all later. Bye.